Hello, folks. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here. We're just going to give people a few minutes to sign in here. We'll get started in just 1 minute. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start in just 1 minute. If you do require captioning, as you can see on the screen, you can just click on More at the bottom of your screen and then click on Live Captioning, which will be available. If you have any questions, please do feel free to put them into the chat, and we will do our best to come to you. All right, folks, it's 2 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to get us going. Hello, bonjour, and bonjour. It's a pleasure to greet you in both of Canada's official languages, and I say official, but also in Ojibwe, which is one of the traditional languages of the Anishinaabe peoples. And thank you all for taking the time to join today's session, Reconciling Identity, a discussion about two-spirit people within the 2S LGBTQI+ communities. And I am particularly excited about today's conversation. My name is Michael Bach. My pronouns are he, him, his, and it is an honor for me that you have taken the time to join us today. This is our third event in the 2S LGBTQI+ learning series, and I'm so proud to say that we had over 1,300 people registered for this event. So clearly there is a thirst for the knowledge. And it's not even June, so who knew? So thank you for being here. If you're having any technical issues, I'll ask that you send a message in the chat to the host. Select host from the dropdown before sending your message. However, I will not be helping you. I am helped today by my amazing colleague Hector from CCDI Consulting and my wonderful friends from Bold Woman Brands, Caitlin and Moira, who will be happy to assist you. So as is tradition, I want to start with my presentation with a land acknowledgement. However, for today's session, and considering the topic and who my guests are, and with the recent passing of Queen Elizabeth and all of the media around the monarch, I've been thinking a lot about what is appropriate in this conversation. So not to be glib, but I have compared land acknowledgement to taking someone's phone. So imagine that I have taken your phone and I acknowledge that I have taken your phone, but I don't give it back. Land acknowledgement is similar, but what do we do to make amends for taking someone's phone? Don't get me wrong, land acknowledgement is really important. It's the first step towards reconciliation, but it's just that, it's one step. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, it was one of the 94 calls to action. But can you name any of the others? I acknowledge that I am a descendant of settlers, and I join you today from the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, commonly now called the City of Toronto, that is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. But I also commit myself to a journey of reconciliation, and I want to provide you with two pieces of information to help you on your journey. First, I'm going to ask my friends Caitlin and Moira to paste a link in the chat to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's reports, plural. And I'm going to encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to read some of the information you find there. Even if you just read the calls to action report, which is a summary of those 94 calls to action. Every person who calls this land home has a responsibility to educate themselves so we can be part of the solution. Second, as always, I'm going to encourage you to download the app Whose Land, which is available free for iPhone and Android. And you can also go to their website at whose.land. And what I love about this app is it uses videos and storytelling to talk about the importance of land acknowledgement. And it also uses GPS in your phone, tablet, or computer to identify where you are in the country and tell you what are the traditional territories that you occupy. What are the nearest First Nations to your location? What are the treaties and agreements related to those lands, if any exist, keeping in mind that much of the country is still unceded territory? And most recently, they added your geographic location to residential schools, and considering everything that has been going on over the past couple of years related to the discovery of unmarked graves, I think it's really important that we understand where we are physically to those locations. The time has come for everyone who calls this country home to start on their journey and to be part of reconciliation. Now, before we get into today's conversation, I feel like I can't believe I have to do this, but I have to remind everyone that today is an opportunity for learning and dialogue. But in order for us to do that, we need to be respectful of one another. Events like this may have the potential to attract people who are just here to be disruptive and disrespectful. If that's what you're here for, just know that I have two pretty tough bouncers who will happily eject anyone from the session if they choose to use language in the chat that is disrespectful, racist, homophobic, transphobic, or biphobic. That isn't to say that we can't have a healthy discourse. We absolutely can. I don't expect everyone to agree with me or the panelists. That's not the point. You're welcome to share your thoughts in the chat function, but please do so in a respectful manner. Also, please remember that you're here to listen to a discussion by a couple wonderful panelists. So try to limit the side chatter that goes on in the chat, although it is being monitored. Little bit more about me. For those of you who don't know me, I am the CEO of CCDI Consulting, and I've been working in the areas of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility for over 17 years. Previously, I was the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion for KPMG's operations in Canada, and I was the deputy chief diversity officer for KPMG globally. One piece of information very important to today's conversation, so feel free to write it down or take a snapshot, and that is the last bullet, which is I have a postgraduate certificate in diversity management from Cornell University. And why that's important to today's conversation is it was really expensive, and I am still paying it off. So I need to keep mentioning it until it's fully amortized. In addition to my professional work, though, I have been a community activist, and I put that in air quotes, for over 30 years, specifically working in the 2S LGBTQI+ space, as well as with people with disabilities and newcomers. I'm also the fool who wrote a couple books. My first book, Birds of All Feathers, Doing Diversity and Inclusion Right, came out in August of 2020 and is a Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and Amazon bestseller, and recipient of the Silver 2020 Nautilus Book Award in the category of Rising to the Moment. To be clear, bestseller does not mean good, just that I sold a lot of copies, and no, you cannot have your money back. And thanks to all of you lovely people, my new book, Alphabet Soup, The Essential Guide to LGBTQ2+ Inclusion at Work, made the Toronto Star bestseller list on June 1st, which I think is totally appropriate. So thanks to you, all of you who purchased already, and shame on you who haven't. I'm kidding. If you'd like to know more about these best-selling and soon-to-be award-winning books, you can go to alphabetsoup.lgbt to find out where you can pick up your copies. I am actually going to be doing a draw for 50 people to receive a free copy of the ebook of Alphabet Soup. We'll be doing that after this session, and winners will be notified by email. But you do have to be here to win. Very briefly, I would probably get fired if I didn't mention this. I work for CCDI Consulting, not to be confused with the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, or CCDI. We are related, but we are separate. And while I am the founder of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, I only work for CCDI Consulting. And CCDI Consulting provides consulting services in inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility to employers large and small, local, national, and international in all sectors. You can learn more at our website at ccdiconsulting.ca, or you can connect with us on social media. We are at CCDI Consulting. So here's today's agenda. It's broken up into 2 sections, as has been the case with the previous sessions. First, I'll be spending about 10-ish minutes establishing a foundation of information about what we're going to talk about today. For some of you, may be a bit remedial. However, it's really important that everyone has an understanding of what we're talking about so they can follow along with the second part, which is going to be about a 30-minute discussion on the 2S in the initialism, 2S LGBTQI+, coming to you from a firsthand perspective. I have 2 fantastic people who are going to be joining us for this roundtable. We will, of course, allow some time for questions from all of you. So I hope you have some. Otherwise, I'm going to be doing an interpretive dance, and I don't think you want to see that. About questions, I want to let you know how you can ask them. If you are joining us via Zoom, you'll see a button that says Q&A. It may either be at the top or the bottom, depending on how you access the session. You can click on it, type your question. You can do that at any time during the session. However, your questions go into a queue and we will get to them at the latter part of the session. Please do not use the chat function to ask questions. While the chat is being monitored, it's not being monitored for questions. So put them in the Q&A. If you're joining us via the live stream on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, hey, but we're going to try to use the chat function on those platforms. So feel free to pose your question and hopefully it will work. This is a bit untested, but we'll see how it goes. And if you haven't done so already, you can, of course, connect with me on social media. I am at the Michael Bach. I'm going to start by answering the question that I always get asked, and that is, will I share my slides? Yes, I will share my slides, although frankly, the slides are not the most interesting part of today's conversation. You'll receive a follow-up email after the session with a link to download the PDF of the slides and to rewatch the broadcast, should you wish. So with that, let's get started. Very briefly, I wanted to start with some terminology just as a reminder and let you know, frankly, about a change that has occurred. So if you've attended one of these events before, you should know by now what the initialism LGBTQ2+ stands for: lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans or trans-identified, queer, two-spirit, plus. If you don't know what any of those letters represent, I will point you in the direction of my book or Google to find out more. However, there's actually been a very recent change. And as I've said before, we at CCDI Consulting have followed the Canadian federal government, which up until recently used the initialism LGBTQ2, and we added the plus sign to ensure that we were being inclusive of all sexual and gender minorities. However, on August 28th, the Prime Minister launched Canada's first federal 2S LGBTQI+ action plan, with the objective of continuing to build a more inclusive future. And with that, they're shifting to the initialism 2S LGBTQI+. From the government's website, they explain the change as follows. Based on extensive consultation with 2S LGBTQI+ communities across the country, the government of Canada will adopt and encourage the use of 2S LGBTQI+ acronym. I'm not going to do it in French. Which is more inclusive and places the experiences of Indigenous 2S LGBTQI+ communities at the foreground as the first 2S LGBTQI peoples in North America. We fully support this change, and as such, we will now be using the initialism 2S, LGBTQI+, or two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, plus. We're not completely aligned with the feds and are still using transgender instead of the abbreviated trans or trans identified, which is more inclusive of people who are gender diverse. And they have, as a point, added the I for intersex. But we believe this is a great step in the right direction. And now I have to completely redo my book. So if you have it already, it is a collector's item. So let's take a look at this term, two-spirit. And I'm going to discuss this with Todd and Sandy, but I wanted to start by giving you just a scooch of history of where that term comes from. I want to be very clear up front that I am not Indigenous and not deeply familiar with the history. I can only provide you with the knowledge that I've gleaned from my research. The term two-spirit was created at what was referred to as, the Native American / First Nations Lesbian and Gay International Gathering, which took place in Winnipeg in 1990 and was chosen to distinguish and distance Indigenous people from non-Native peoples. The term was not intended to be interchangeable with LGBT Indigenous persons. Rather, it was created in English to serve as a pan-Indigenous unifier to be used for general audiences instead of the traditional terms in Indigenous languages for what are diverse, culturally specific, ceremonial and social roles that can vary widely. Well, it's unclear exactly who came up with the term. One account says that it was proposed by an Anishinaabe elder named Myra Laramie after the term came to her in a dream. There are other references to several Indigenous and non-Indigenous anthropologists, including Dr. Wesley Thomas of the Dene Nation. The term is not perfect, and there has been just as many people who have embraced it as who have rejected it. And I want to talk about that. But for that, I'm going to bring in my guests because I know they have an opinion on this and they're far more educated on this than I. So now that you have this brief primer, I'm delighted to bring my guests for a wonderful panel discussion. I have a couple pretty amazing people who have been, they volunteered, never mind what they may tell you, but I'm just lucky to have them here today. So once I'm done introducing them, I will stop sharing my presentation so that you can see us all. So Sandra Laframboise, also known as Sandy Leo, is a longtime advocate and staunch human rights activist for transgender people and health to transgender folks since 1971. Sandy's a member of the Métis Nation and resides on the beautiful Coast Salish territory, now known as the City of Vancouver. Sandy identifies as two-spirit / transgender. Todd Ross has been advocating for 2S LGBTQI+ inclusion for decades. Todd previously served in the Canadian Armed Forces and was one of the plaintiffs in the successful class action lawsuit against the Canadian government related to the systemic discrimination of 2S LGBTQI+ people in the Canadian Armed Forces, the RCMP, and the Civil Service, also known as the LGBT Purge. Todd is a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario and identifies as two-spirit. He now lives in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and works as the Indigenous Advisor at the University of New Brunswick. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and ask both Todd and Sandy to join me on camera, and we can have a fabulous chat. Hello, my friends. Thank you so much for joining me today. So let's start with the basics. As members of the 2S LGBTQI+ communities, can you share your stories about your experience with 2S LGBTQI+ inclusion, particularly in the workplace? And Todd, I'm gonna start with you on this.
Right. Hello, everyone. Nin wabanakwat nidishnakaz migizi nin dodum Duck Lake onjaba nukamus. I introduced myself with my spirit name, and I'm Eagle Clan, and my grandmother is from Duck Lake. As Michael said, I'm Métis. and a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And now I'm joining you from what was known as Monaquesk, which you may know as St. John, New Brunswick, which is the traditional lands of the Wolastoqiyik, which are part of the Wabanaki Confederacy. Thank you for inviting me. And my story is one that is I've shared a fair bit, so you can Google me and see it a couple times. As a young kid growing up in New Brunswick, my dad's a settler from this area, and my mom was from Saskatchewan. I was anxious to get away from New Brunswick as soon as I could. I'm back again, but at that time, I really wanted to leave. So I joined the Canadian Armed Forces at the age of 18, ended up in the Navy just by fluke. It wasn't I didn't seek it out, although I do like the uniform. And went through my training and ended up on the West Coast in Victoria on the HMCS Saskatchewan as a Naval Combat Information Operator. Sounds a lot fancier than it is. It means I watched the radars. So after about a year in the military, I came under investigation. And what likely started out as a security investigation, because I seemed like I was a threat to the country, I guess. And for a period of a year and a half, I went through a series of interrogations, being pulled off the ship just as the ship was about to sail, being taken away in these light blue K cars, which the military police of the day would drive, always in these tacky suits. And went through a year and a half, 6 polygraph examinations, lie detectors, and taking investigators into my apartment, handing over all of my personal documents, having them go through everything. And in the end, 2 things came about. One is I was still deeply closeted at the time. I hadn't come out to myself. And through the course of investigations, I was asked if I was gay several times. I always tried to get around it. I tried to fool the polygraph exams, which I did once. Eventually, I broke down after about a year or so and said, yes, I'm gay. They kind of like closed the book and said, okay, that's what we wanted to know. And that's when they went through all of my documents. The second thing that happened was, as they were going through my documents, they came across a photograph that I owned. And in the background of the photograph was a radio frequency on the wall. And so they said, well, because you have this picture in your possession, we're probably going to take away your security clearance, which means you will spend the rest of your time, another 6 months in the military, sweeping streets or doing something similar. But you won't be able to be on the ship. You'll have to be doing something that doesn't require security clearance, or we'll give you an honorable discharge. So I jumped at the chance of getting the honorable discharge. I was told at that time that I was not considered a veteran, that I would never be considered a veteran, to apply for any of the benefits. Essentially, I had disgraced the uniform and had let my country down. Remembering that I'm still in the closet, so I was fired for being gay, and sent back home 6 months early to New Brunswick, where I still hadn't really come out to myself. The only time I'd come out was in an official government recording. So sent back to my parents, where, you know, the easy answer to them was, well, I was investigated for espionage, and I had a photograph, and I was given a discharge, an honorable discharge, and that's the end of the story. So I lived with that for quite a while. Came out a couple years later, bursting out of the closet. And then fast forward about 25, 26 years later, started a class action lawsuit with 2 other individuals where we successfully sued the federal government and received an apology from every leader in the House of Commons, acknowledging that what they did was wrong, that we are in fact veterans, that we did serve honorably, and that nothing we did was wrong, but yet our government let us down. So that's my story of how I faced discrimination in the workforce.
Thank you. Sandy.
Thank you for that, Todd. And thank you for your work. You know, as we do this work, we stand on shoulders of others before us and others stand on our shoulders. And I think the cycle of life for us is the generations before, the generations after. And I'm sure in your activists like mine, we didn't think about 20 years later and how that would have an impact and change the course of history. We were in it and we had to live it and we had to deal with it. And we weren't thinking about, at least I don't think so, that we were thinking about tomorrow. We were just living in it and we had to deal with it on the spot. I lived in Ottawa. I grew up in Ottawa. My father's Algonquin, my mother's Cree, French, and Irish. And we're ancestrally related to Gabriel Dumont. One of my cousins fought at Batoche. I am a Métis from the lower St. Lawrence River. And I never grew up with my culture until I cleaned up around the age of 29. My family was half dark and the other half was white. And there was always a fight between the 2 colors. You're not Indian enough, you're too white, and this and that. And I think a lot of Métis people will recognize that struggle. I grew up with the derogatory word of being a half-breed, right? So, and being in Ottawa in those days, small, quaint little town, it only had about 100,000 people. Everybody knew everybody. And it was the center of the country where the power lied. And I was 11 and a half years old when I marched from Pestalozzi College to Parliament Hill on the 28th of August, 1971. And a lot of people remember that date because it was the date that we delivered the We Demand Manifesto. And that was my coming out to my parents of being gay, because in those days, it was gays. We didn't have lesbians. Lesbians, the L word came after. It was an evolution, if you want. So not growing up in my culture and being disconnected, I definitely did not identify as just as being a homosexual male. And so I ran away from home once my parents found out I was gay. And I got brought back home by the police a week later and was forced to go to psychiatric counseling emergencies at the Ottawa Carmichael Hospital at 2:00 in the morning. And the psychiatrist came back and said to my father, "I don't think your son is sick." So my father found another psychiatrist at that hospital, and I was forced to go through therapy for several years, in which they were my formative years of rebellion, a good old rebellion person that I became. I was out loud, obnoxious. I was thrown out of school. So I had to find a way to come back. I found other people. We rallied in a little park along the street where the American Embassy is now in Ottawa, but that used to be a cruising park where queer folks hung out. And for years and years and years, I was just out loud, and trans people in those days couldn't really find a job. Couldn't really find a job. You were thrown out of your home by your family. You were ostracized by your school. Churches in those days, and we were brought up in the Catholic Church, were excommunicating us right and left. And you had to deal with all of that. So where do you go? Well, a lot of us in our young age resort to prostitution, sex work. And because of that, we started doing survival sex, and drugs come along and everything else. So life took us in a different direction. Finally had sex reassignment surgery in 1981 And in 1989, started reclaiming my culture because there was always something missing. From 1989 on, I became a very big advocate. I was part of a document called Finding Our Place, the law project, transgender law project. And that was a document that was published. It took us 2 years with community consultation, lawyer Barbara Finley, human rights lawyer. And we co-authored this huge document that was presented in 1997 at the National Conference on Human Rights in Canada, in Victoria. And then I met, during that time, the Justice of the Supreme Court, then Madame Leroux-Dubé, whom I've had a private conversation with and introduced this law reform project to her. And that began really, if you want to really mark history as to when the trans movement started fighting for legal representation in Canada, it was between 1994 and 1997. And simultaneously, different people, different friends of mine started doing research and work and surveys and published. And it became the point to human rights, gender identity protection in Canada. So let's now tie that into Two-Spirit. Because Two-Spirit, as you said earlier, Michael, it was a word, an identity that came up simultaneously, I believe, in different groups. And we're all going to juxtapose to see who's right, who's wrong, and all of this, and Americans and Canadians and all of that, you know, all of that dance that we dance as bird of feathers of different birds. But I was part of that in the early 90s with my friend Albert McLeod, who's now has his PhD in Manitoba, because of his focus on two-spiritedness. And it's quite interesting because it came out afterwards. What we rallied around that word was about identity, which is different than sexual orientation. Let's make that clear. While a lot of people rally under the moniker of two-spiritedness, and they are gays, bisexual, transgendered, lesbians, all of that, it was an identity away from the mainstream LGBTQI alphabet soup. And part of it is because as Indigenous people, I believe that A, we were behaving differently. B, our rallying cries of togetherness was not just based on sex, drugs, and rock and roll and party life, if you want, and our sexual orientation. It was about our Indigenous identity. And so it is an English moniker, and we work with it, and many communities rallied behind it for years. But in the recent 5 to 10 years, people started talking about, well, I'm not two-spirited. It's an English moniker. And I agree with that because I use the term two-spirit / transgendered. A lot of my relatives use the word, I'm not two-spirit, I'm indigiqueer, which is great because when we talk about Indigenous people, we talk about sovereignty. If I'm a sovereign entity in my sovereign land, then I have the right to define who I am in my sovereign land as a sovereign being. So I started questioning if we did a good service or if we did a disservice to the community. That's my critical mind in me. And we did a good service. But now let's take it to a step forward. What does it really mean to be two-spirit in an Indigenous identity? Well, okay, I look at that. And I'm going, well, for example, I live on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and more specifically, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I was adopted into the Tsleil-Waututh, and I lead ceremonies on their traditional lands and given a traditional name. I talk with some Métis youth out of Alberta, and then I talk with some prairie people. And then I look at the work that my friend Harlan Pruden has done and the translation of language, which is where we lose a lot of our Indigenous identity when we try to translate language from the English to Indigenous language. So what I mean by that is, if you're a sovereign entity and you recognize that each region where our First Nations are, then you recognize that as their traditional territories. Living in your traditional territory means that everything you do is connected to your lands, which informs your language, which informs your culture, which informs your practices, your rituals, and your customs. So if that is then connected to the land and to our Indigenous identity, then I ask myself, what would be the word in your land? What would be the word that represents something different, something of two spirits, male and female together? And what I'm finding is it's almost untranslatable. Right? What I'm finding when I look at Harlan Pruden's work is that when you translate two-spirit into the language and then you translate it back into the English language, it's totally different. And some of the words are like really weird. And I'm finding the same thing in the work that I do on a national level around hepatitis C and HIV/AIDS, is when you go to different nations and you translate from English to their language of their local nations, they don't understand. And that's because sometimes there are no words in that language. I don't think in the same language, phonetic language and linguistic ways that the English and the French do. And so that's an important distinction. So I started talking about that, and we're finding words now. You'll find nation to nation different words for two-spirited, because people are now recognizing and moving forward saying, now that we've created the space, now that we've reclaimed our identities, now that we're reclaiming our space in the circle, then let's look a little bit further and look at our traditional language, our traditional connections to the lands, and in these beautiful ways. So, for example, I've been on a committee group with the Musqueam Nation, and they have a two-spirit collectiveness. We're now developing linguistically a word in Halkminam language that will represent Indigenous, indigiqueer two-spirit identities based on the culture and the tradition of the Musqueam Nation. And Tsleil-Waututh is doing the same thing, and different nation is doing the same thing. The Métis youth of Alberta are doing the same. So I suspect within perhaps weeks, perhaps months or years, that we will have different words to add to the Indigenous alphabet soup of the two-spirited communities. Now, the reason for me why it's so important that I use the word transgendered in my two-spirit identity is because I don't want to be erased. I fought since 1971 for the recognition of transsexuality, transgendered people. And all of a sudden, under the English moniker, I'm just two-spirit. There's no way that I want to be erased.
Of course.
So I say,
Sandy, you've sparked. Are these words intended for the Indigenous communities, or are they intended for the non-Indigenous communities, or both? Or
I'll ask Todd for his opinion on that,
okay,
and then I'll add.
Yeah. So Todd, come on in here, and what are your thoughts?
Wow, I'm learning a lot from Sandy, and I believe this is the first time we've met. But you're very knowledgeable, and I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and knowledge here today. For me, it's I also often identified two-spirit gay. That I say I'm a gay man and I'm two-spirited. That I see it as an identity, but I also have to explain to people that I'm Métis. And we carry a lot of labels. And I, depending on who I'm talking to, I'll have people say to me that if you're Métis, you can't be Two-Spirit. And so it's there are some difficulties in community as well, and in different communities. I think that we have to understand who we are. I think that it's more so than the labels that we carry. It's who we are and who we present to be. But it's understanding and here that this is who I am as an individual. This is who I am as a person. I identify as Two-Spirit. I'm a spiritual person. I went to a lot of Catholic masses as a youth. I don't go to those anymore. I have evolved to the point where I had been taught that there was a God, to now that I know that there is spirit, and I feel the interconnectedness with things. So when I look at what the term is, I use it often as a term of convenience, to let other people know how I identify myself. But I also do that as because I'm a spiritual person, and because this is a way that I feel that I am Two-Spirit, that I have that term. So I think as we talk about language for others, and language for us, getting back to the points that Sandy made around self-determination and self-governance, that it's important that we have, that we are involved in creating the language. And I appreciate the people who were involved, Indigenous people who were involved in bringing forward the terminology around Two-Spirit, but also all of the words that aren't lost but are more dormant now, that described people in many of the languages and many of the communities that are still out there. That when we look at individual nations, each nation has their own description, or many nations have their own description. But again, the word Two-Spirit becomes a convenient term to encompass all of those. I think that we'll be reclaiming some of those traditional terminology, and there will probably be some new terminology. To Sandy's point as well, the Métis Nation of Ontario, I had the opportunity to go to our first ever Two-Spirit gathering, where it was 3 or 4 years ago now, where we were able to gather at a hotel in Thunder Bay and have those discussions. It wasn't the nice hotel with the big heavy rug, but the one we always get to stay in. But we had those discussions on what it means for us as individuals in community, and what it means, and the terminology around Two-Spirit, and what it means as Métis people, and who do we look to in our community as kind of our knowledge keepers, and how do we build that knowledge and share that knowledge. So those are just some thoughts based on the great knowledge that Sandy has been sharing.
Yeah. You said something, Todd, that really sticks in my brain, and that is how we just love to label things. We love our little box, and particularly when we're not part of the community, or communities, as I refer to them often. There is people struggle, like they want to put a label on us and say, "Oh, you're X, you're gay, you're Two-Spirit, you're." And sometimes those labels stick, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes we use those labels because it's just easier than saying anything else.
It keeps you employed as a novel writer, as a writer of books. You have to do revisions all the time.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yes.
Okay, so
edited copies, second volume,
Absolutely.
Third volume. I really like what you said, Michael, about Todd, sorry, about in the future, there'll be new words. And it is because language evolves, right? Practices evolve, culture evolves. We like to hold on to the past and we try to reenact some of our past. But if we look at our past, Canada is not a nice country. People like to think it is, but it was imposed on us Indigenous people. We had a royal agreement with the kings of back then, and it was totally disrespected, and we were taken over. So we never went to war. We never lost a war with the crown. It's just they took over. And that was it. So that's why we say stolen and unceded lands, because they are stolen. Every extraction of resources, every selling of every houses, and whoever's getting that money is our resources. And so it's a hard one to think, because as we're reclaiming, and as you talk about the truth and reconciliation and the 94 calls to action, by the way, and if you look at section 21, 28, and down, it talks about establishing a respectful relationship based on mutual agreements, health, justice, sports, education, all of that. So, and that's what we're doing. When we're talking about Two-Spirit in these forums, we're implementing a part of the truth and reconciliation. We're educating, we're involving our people, we're coming together, and we're building this and moving forward as a group. With that in mind, I just want to go back to these nation-to-nation words that I saw in the chat, in the Q&A, that someone asked about that. The people I quoted was Dr. Albert McLeod from Manitoba Two-Spirit Society, and Harlan Pruden, Cree Native person doing his PhD in Two-Spirit study. But the other person that's doing Two-Spirit studies, but more in Musqueam Halkanidim language, is Karina Sparrow of the Musqueam Nation. And I've been working with universities across this land as well on different issues around indigeneity, because everybody likes to create a pan-indigeneity, whether you're writing a research, you're writing a book, and they say we consulted. Well, I can stand here in front of you and say, I'm not representative of the entire transgender community or the Métis Nation or the Two-Spirited community or the Indigenous queer. What you're getting is my perspective and my life experience. And because of that, it makes me a piece of the expertise and a piece of the knowledge basket that we hold. And so, therefore, with that, I'm a knowledge keeper, but of my knowledge, of my life experience, right? And I carry in that basket the stories of others. And so I have to acknowledge the people before me who died for being who they are in this wonderful, beautiful country called KKK Canada. Think about that.
I am thinking about that and loving it. And you're so right. You're so right that, when we're having a conversation with a person, they do not represent all people. I do not represent all men. I do not represent all white people, all gender nonconforming people, all gay people, because I can't. I can share my one story, and more often than not, people are looking to us to speak on behalf, and that is, I think, quite dangerous. I'm aware the questions are coming in. We have about 10 minutes left. This is fantastic. I think we could be here all day. Please feel free to drop your question in the Q&A button, not the chat. And for those that I saw a couple hands raised, we're not going to be doing live questions. They'll just be done through the Q&A to make it simpler on everyone. So there's a question here from Catherine that I want to ask, and it's an interesting one, I think. Traditionally, were Two-Spirit people also spiritual leaders, practitioners, and or artists?
Yeah, short answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
The long answer is different nation would have different ways of doing and practicing and being. And so some nations, they don't talk about it, and other nations, they do talk about it. The Dene Nation out of Arizona area have a beautiful story about a recognized two-spirit person called Wewa. And so if you look it up on Google, you'll find a beautiful story about Wewa. And they also, in their language and in their creation stories, they recognize all these different gender roles and identities and different levels. So that's one group. The Mojave people also had a ceremony if you're two-spirited or you were deemed possessing two-spirit. So there are recorded stories being told by the elders, and sometimes you'll find it in historical traditional storytelling as well. And just recently this morning, I saw an article, I'm going to go read a lot more about it, out of the Algonquin Odawa people, that there was a chief who married a trans-identified person according to the language today, right? Trans feminine person. So, and the Cheyennes also had stories and petroglyphs and things like that. So there are different nation, again, different stories, different rituals, different ways of being, different acknowledgement. The important thing to retain here is pre-colonization. We didn't have a concept of sending you away because you were different than us. We had concepts of justice and stuff like that. But I think more importantly is we try to find an explanation of why this person was different and how that person as a gift can be incorporated into the community for the benefit of the community. We were not really individualistic people back then. Mm-hmm. We were more tribal people living together, living in community. And so we've lost a lot of that today, but they were. And for me, on Tsleil-Waututh Nation, what really stuck for me is one day, one of their speakers, I was in ceremony, and said, Sandy, if I died today, I'll be okay knowing that my children are taken care of by you. And he says, yes, in our ways, you're a traditional orphan nanny. Mm-hmm. So my children will be taken care of. And I went, what? Right? Because we're learning as well. We're reclaiming, we're relearning things that were lost. And so to be told such stories, it just gives me goosebumps, right? Yeah. Because our history is oral. It's petroglyphic. It's not a written language the same way that you look at English and French and other languages, right? And so to be told such a story in ceremony, I'm going, holy moly, guacamole.
Yeah, as long as you don't have to put them through college.
And yes, as Métis people, we're recognized as an Indigenous nation in Canada. So therefore, yes, as Métis people, we can use that language. And as Todd said, we are sovereign people. So yeah. And as I said, so self-determinance, my dear.
There's a series of questions in the Q&A. They all sort of center around this theme of labeling being Eurocentric, being colonized, coming from a colonizing perspective. Terminology of as a convenience was mentioned. How do you explain that to non-Indigenous people, particularly like me? Like I've got a label gun. I put a label on everything. How do we explain that? How do we get past that idea of labeling? Todd, why don't I start with you, and then we'll go to Sandy.
Yeah, and you know, I think I was saying before that it is really it really is convenience. It's so people understand, and it's an easy way for people to feel that they're able to understand where you're coming from by having these labels and by having these descriptives, and they are kind of, I mean, we're not getting rid of them, not right away, so they're here to stay for a while. So use them to advantage, and you know, embrace the labels that you have. So live your best life with those labels. I did see one question in there that I wanted to address, that somebody said, is it okay for them to identify as Two-Spirit, or is it okay for settlers to identify as Two-Spirit? And I was, my perspective on this is no. That as Indigenous people, we don't have much left, so leave us this.
Do we have to take it again? Really?
But no, I think that you know, it goes back to that understanding who you are and feeling comfortable with who you are, and living your best self. And I'll let Sandy say wiser words than me.
Yeah, that question, can I use the word Two-Spirit? It's quite an interesting political hot potato. Because first it came out, and yes, as an English moniker, and yes, people will try to rough us up with their words saying, oh, you don't own the language. And you're correct, you don't, but we own our identity. We self-identify, we self-determine, and on our lands. Everybody else is an uninvited guest. No matter what your intersectionality is, you're still an uninvited guest. Sorry about that.
Okay.
That means it's time for Michael to dance.
Yeah.
There you go. and because of that, and because we reclaimed this word for us to rally in our identity, it cannot be used if you're not Indigenous from Turtle Island. Yeah. We've had requests from all over, and in fact, I got into an argument with somebody about it. You know, we moved from the 70s and 80s as being Berdache, and Berdache is actually a Persian derivative. And so when you start looking at language, you got to start looking at the cultural component of the language and the words being used and the representation of them, because they are connected to culture, right? So I would say no, if you're not Indigenous, you can't use it. And most of my friends would say the same thing.
Yeah, I think so. I feel there's a lot of comments in the comment box saying we need a part 2. So I think I may have to have a conversation with you about that. I want to say thank you, merci beaucoup, and miigwech for joining us today. Sandy and Todd, I mean, really, I feel like we could just be here all day having this conversation, because it's so important, and we need to have this. Some quick housekeeping. I want to say thank you to Caitlin and Moira from Bold Woman Brands for their help, to Hector for making sure that I didn't blow things up. And also I want to say thank you to all the attendees. We had well over 600 people on at one point, and just really appreciate you all joining us here. Like I said, we're going to be doing a draw for 50 lucky people who are going to get a copy of Alphabet Soup, The Essential Guide to LGBTQ2+ Inclusion, with an old initialism that I'm now going to have to update, but I happily do that. And people will be notified by email after the fact. Also, everyone will receive an email after the fact, which will include a link to a site where you can get the presentation, but also a recording of this video. October is 2S LGBTQI+ History Month, and I will be posting something at least once a day, possibly twice a day or more during that month, to help educate people on 2S LGBTQI+ history and inclusion. So make sure that you are following me. I am at the Michael Bach on all of the social media platforms, or at least the ones I'm on, specifically Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So be sure to follow me if you're not already doing so. We have one more of these wonderful events in 2022, which is going to be held in November. It's called All the Tea, a discussion on gender within the 2S LGBTQI+ communities, where we are just going to talk about gender through that whole conversation. That'll happen on Wednesday, November 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And there will be in that email, which includes the link, you can register for that event. So please do so. Thank you. I really appreciate everybody being here for today's session, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.